All right. Hello and welcome, everyone. We're so glad that you could be joining us. My name is Stephanie, and I'll be your co-host for today. This webinar is one of several webinars that are a part of our larger BrainHQ Academy series. The topic today is going to be the neuroscience of sleep. Let's go ahead and see what's on the agenda for today. So first off, we're going to kick the presentation off with a poll. There are going to be a couple of questions that come up on screen in a minute, and I'll give you more information about how to provide those answers when we get there. Following that, we are going to be listening to a presentation from our senior scientist here at Posit Science, Dr. Tom Van Vliet. He is a newcomer to the webinar series here, so I hope you all will give him a warm welcome today. Now, Tom earned a dual doctorate in neuroscience and clinical psychology at Northern Illinois University and had additional training in neuropsychology at the University of Chicago. Like I said, he's been with Posit Science for a while now as a senior scientist and is also our director of sponsored programs here. Now, our guest today, we're very excited for, it is going to be Dr. Eric Prather. Now, Dr. Prather is a professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences and the director of behavioral sleep medicine research program at the University of California, San Francisco. So we're very, very excited to have him joining us today. After the discussion between Tom and Eric, we are going to move to a live Q&A section. So if at any point during the presentation today you'd like to ask a question, you can click on the Q&A button on the Zoom control panel and a new window will pop up. From there, you can type in any questions that you might have, and then we'll do our best to answer as many of those as we can. Now, there are a lot more of you in the audience today than there are of us, so we aren't going to be able to answer every question, but I will be fielding those questions and doing my best to sort of combine them and answer as many questions as possible. Now, one other thing that I wanted to note is that today's webinar is being recorded and it will get posted to our YouTube channel in the coming days. So if you'd like to be notified when that video goes live, you can go to youtube.com/BrainHQ and subscribe there in order to receive a notification. Now, everyone who's registered for this webinar today is also going to receive an email sometime next week with any follow-up resources that we may mention, but we will also include a link to the replay. All right, so let's go ahead and kick off with a poll here. So this poll is going to be composed of two different questions. So the first question you should see popping up on your screen now is, how much sleep on average do you get per night? Now, this is going to be a single choice answer there. So you're just going to click on one of those and submit that. And then the second question that we're asking, what habits do you do to get ready for bed? We're talking a little bit about sleep hygiene today too. So for the sleep hygiene question, it's going to be multiple choice. So you can check the box next to each one of those habits that you all do before bed. All right, Tom and Eric, let's banter a little bit during the poll session here while we're waiting folks to get their answers in. Tom, how much sleep did you get last night? What would you say?
Yeah, the irony of discussing sleep in the context of a sleep webinar after having a poor night's sleep is not lost on me.
Yeah.
I'll do my best. I probably got about 6.5 hours.
Yeah, I was probably sitting up between 6 and 7 hours, and I am on my probably fourth serving of coffee today. So,
okay, sure.
Yeah.
We'll speak
Eric,
about that in our slides here.
Yeah.
For the effects of coffee. So
yeah,
for now.
Absolutely. Eric, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, no big surprise. I'm I buy every little gadget they have to measure your sleep, and so the one I'm using currently tells me that I slept 7 hours and 43 minutes.
Oh,
so, which
that's pretty good.
Sounds pretty right to me.
Nice.
Yeah. And then as for sleep hygienes, do you guys have any specific things that you do in your sort of wind down towards the end of the night, getting ready for bed?
Yeah, I typically read and I go to bed typically around the same time every night, and I have small kids, so I have to be up at the same time every morning. So that forces me into a routine that seems to be well conserved.
Yeah, same. I also have two little kids, Tom and I, and it's so it's like having a human alarm clock. But yeah, to wind down for me, I think probably it's like my wife and I probably watch television. Like, I think that's probably like the most common thing, though it's like interspersed with like trying to get our kids in bed because they're kind of come back and forth all throughout the night. So by the time they finally get down, I'm sleepy enough to kind of do it myself.
Right.
All right. So it looks like actually we've got everybody who have answered all of the questions so far. So I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and we can briefly chat about the results here. So for our audience members today, how much sleep on average do you get per night? 61% of you said somewhere between 6 and 8 hours. So what is the typical recommendation for people getting, how many hours of sleep per night would you guys say?
Well, I would defer to Eric on this question, but we're 7 to 9.
Yeah, sure. So the American Academy of Sleep Medicine and the Sleep Research Society and kind of all of the kind of national, international boards around sleep recommend at least 7 hours to maintain optimal adult health. Of course, it changes as we age, and the recommendation only goes up to 65 years of age, in part because there's this drop off in kind of the amount of sleep that people get as we age, and it's the science isn't clear about what to make of that. Historically, the National Sleep Foundation has reported kind of 7 to 9 hours as the range, and I think that's right. We do know that at least at the earlier cutoff, it's at least 7 hours.
Got it. And then as for sleep hygiene, it looks like our top answers or our top responses here, people love changing into their pajamas right before bed. Makes sense. People like to brush their teeth and take care of their dental hygiene. And our third runner up there is reading or some sort of other analog activity. So these are all going to be things that we are going to be touching on today, which is great. All right, so that's going to wrap it up for the poll portion. Let's go ahead and transition to Tom's presentation. Tom, take it away whenever you're ready.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I thought I'd like to start with a caveat that I'm not a medical doctor. I'm a research scientist, and therefore what I'm presenting today is what we know from the science to date, which science is sort of an ongoing process, and there's very few definitive answers to many of the questions that we'll raise today, although we'll do our best to align our responses with what we do know from well-controlled studies. But if you do have a chronic sleep issue that is vexing, I would encourage you to see your primary care physician to get checked out more formally. Okay, so I think I can advance the slides. If not, perhaps, Stephanie, could you go to the next slide? So what is sleep? It's been defined by some sleep experts, notably Matt Walker here, as your superpower. And why is it your superpower? Because sleep does play a critical and life-supporting role in restoring the brain and body after, a full day of 16 hours of activity while you're awake. And also, it's quite clear that sleep is not a passive process. Although we wind down and sort of do nothing and clear our minds to fall asleep, there's a lot of activity that ensues underneath the skull that we'll go through a little bit more detail in subsequent slides. But just know that your brain is doing a whole lot, as well as your body. And we'll talk a bit about more about that as we proceed. And I'm going to ask Stephanie to advance the next slide. Thank you. So it's important also to realize that nearly all animals sleep. There's this interesting new finding about jumping spiders, as if spiders aren't scary enough. They have a jumping varietal that can get to you, apparently. And even when they sleep, they exhibit REM movements in their eyes. So it was my impression that, spiders perhaps orient their eyes. They don't quite focus like we do with a fovea. But sure enough, there's great videos online. You could Google this, and you can see these little spiders moving their eyes, much like we do, in a rapid motion during certain stages of sleep. And so very interested in this regard. Also very similar to that is the octopus. So you can see in the larger image, this octopus is sort of catatonic, paralyzed. All the blood flow is sort of vacant from the extremities. And the heart rate is probably very low, much like ours dips throughout the night. And then during various phases of sleep, you can see in the lower left, the octopus becomes very, very activated, even though it's fully asleep, much like our brains do when we're sleeping. Perhaps the main difference may be is that most of our body is paralyzed when we're dreaming particularly, And in the octopus, you could still see muscle contractions and suckers moving and blood flow coursing through the extremities. And then also a curiosity here, these sperm whales all sleep in unison in a vertical position and in 15-minute intervals cohesively together. Very, very interesting. I don't know a whole lot of the science behind this, but it was quite fascinating for me to discover this fact. Okay, the next slide, please. Okay, so as I said, there's a lot going on in your brain when we sleep. It's far from being a passive activity. And in fact, scientists look at stages of activity that are characteristic, and these are divided primarily into REM, rapid eye movement stages, where you can actually see the moves, the eyes moving underneath the eyelids, and non-REM sleep, which is further divided into 3 stages of increasing depth. And on the panel on the left, if you were to record activity from the brain, you can see when you're awake and alert that your brain is firing at a pretty consistent rate. There's a lot of high density waveforms there and the relaxed wakefulness. And as you fall asleep, your brain slowly changes its characteristic activation patterns through various stages. And we'll go into this a bit more detail. But basically, we go through 4 stages, roughly. The first of which is characterized by REM, again, the rapid eye movements, and is most associated with dreaming, which we'll talk a bit about more today. But then stages 2 and then finally 3 go into a much greater depth, and the pace at which the brain is firing is greatly slowed. In fact, this is called slow wave sleep or deep sleep. And this is thought to be one of the most restorative aspects of sleep. And we'll talk a bit more about that as we go through. And then as we come up out of that deep stage, stage 4, up into REM again, we can see brain waveforms that look very similar to the waking brain state. If you compare the top image with the very bottom image on that panel, you can see that the activation pattern looks very similar, even with sort of early stage sleep or light sleep. And on the panel on the right, this is the typical night. And what's interesting about these brain activation patterns is that they cycle roughly every 90 minutes. So you're going through each one of these stages characteristically and linearly across the night. And you're traversing this, 5 to 6 times if you're sleeping well, or less if you're not. And what's unique about this is that the depth of sleep is usually the first half. As you can see, the waveforms on this panel on the right reach that lower stage 4 most prominently in the first half of sleep. So if this is an 8-hour cycle, looking at the first 4 hours are characterized by mostly deep sleep, a little bit of REM, and then the second half of sleep is predominantly characterized by REM sleep or dreaming. So quite an interesting sort of depth of processing early on, and then coming up out of that as we approach the morning. Next slide. Great, thanks. And then, so here's the question on everyone's mind, including myself. And I'm not sure if we have super compelling answers to address the sort of magnitude or scope of all the things that we experience at night in our dreams. It's quite a wild ride for some people, and there could be prevailing themes that reoccur in many of us. I know they do for me. But what I want to draw to your attention here is that the similarity of REM sleep looks very distinctly similar to a wakefulness. So the brain activation is nearly indistinguishable with a few exceptions. One is that the brain, as I said before, cuts off at the level of the brainstem all the alpha motor neurons, or it prevents your body from moving right at the initiation of REM sleep. And as you come out of REM sleep into the lighter stages of sleep, you're most likely to move because your body has been paralyzed essentially for the duration of the REM or the dream-like behavior. And your body is sort of slumped in some position. And usually this is the time of the night where we move around and shift positions as we're coming out of one of these cycles. So a few interesting things to say about dreams. We know a few things from the science. We know that one function of dreams may be to solve problems and or provide some sense of emotional offloading. So there are studies that show if you were to teach people about a maze without a clear answer, one group goes to sleep, the other group stays awake. The folks that went to sleep during this period of time of the intervention, during the maze solution period, came up with more viable solutions as a result of having slept and dreamt perhaps about the problem Most notably, the data was driven by the fact that those people who had an explicit dream about the maze were more likely to come up with novel solutions and more frequently solve the maze, if you will, relative to those who did not sleep during that same time period. So there's something going on here in sort of the processing of what happened during the day, life challenges, learning opportunities, and also sort of the progression from new learning into sort of more ingrained and associative learning. So what you learned during the day may be relevant to other things you learned before, or there may be an association between a couple things you learned during the day that your brain will kick around at night, particularly during REM sleep, and form new associations that were previously unknown to you when you're in the waking state. And then also, it's really fascinating to me, and this is a new fact I learned too, is that the brain also goes through an emotional offloading process, particularly during REM sleep. And it's quite interesting that if you actually have a series of bad nights of sleep, your emotional tolerance during the waking days that intervene is much lower, and you're more likely to be stressed out by emotionally distressing events. And in fact, if you look at the amygdala, which is a part of the brain that processes emotions, particularly strong emotions, you can see as much as a 60% increase in activity in the amygdala following a series of bad nights of sleep. So you're much more reactive emotionally, and one function of dreams and REM may be to offload some of that emotional weight. And then also I want to draw a division between, as I said before, the first half of sleep and the second half of sleep. They seem to be different characteristically in terms of the type of sleep you experience. The first half being more deep sleep, slow wave sleep, second half being more REM sleep. And what happens during this period is quite interesting in that there's a lot of physiological restoration, bolstering in your blood pressure, bolstering your immune response. Those folks that experience a bad night's sleep produce 50% less antibodies if they're given a vaccine the preceding day. And they're more likely to get a contraction of the common cold if they have fragmented sleep during this period. And then most fascinating and most novel in terms of recent discoveries is the discovery of what's called the glymphatic system. We may be familiar with the lymphatic system in the bloodstream or the vasculature, which sort of serves a cleaning function for the blood flow throughout the body. Now, only recently discovered there's a similar system or an analogous system called the glymphatic system that ushers in cerebral spinal fluid to the brain. And then at night, and only during slow wave sleep, the stage 4, very deep sleep, does it usher out waste materials, metabolic waste materials, proteins, etc. And one notable protein that we're going to talk a bit more about today is beta amyloid. So this is the protein that has a sticky property and has been most associated with Alzheimer's dementia. And so the second half of sleep, as I said before, is mostly REM biased. You do most of your dreaming in the second half of the night. Also coincident with that is the release of testosterone. So with that, in the absence of good REM sleep, you can actually express up to 10% less testosterone. And if this is a cyclical pattern where you're not getting good REM sleep or you're getting poor second half of the night sleep, you can actually age yourself in a testosterone releasing perspective by as much as 10 years by losing 10% of your testosterone expression. And this applies to men as well as it does to women, because there's many functions of testosterone that serve women as well. In addition to that, there's growth hormone releases, metabolic processes, tissue repair, and as I mentioned, emotional offloading that occurs during the second half of sleep. Okay, so what's most important about learning and memory? This is an interesting sandwich type scenario in that on one side of the sandwich, the bread that starts off the sandwich is really the sleep the night before you learn. To enable good learning, you have to have good sleep, because in the absence of good sleep, you don't have good attention. And if you can't pay attention, or your attention is divergent, or you're sluggish, you're not going to encode relevant information. In this example, the classroom is here learning about that Paris is the capital of France, and those kids that are attending to the lecture will probably be more likely to encode this information, whereas those who are sleepy or divergent or distracted will be less likely to encode a good representation of this knowledge. And if you are paying attention, you could sort of associate a few things in your mind as shown here in the image. Yeah, the Eiffel Tower is in France, and oh, France is a country in Europe. Oh, here's a map of Europe. And these sort of thoughts are and associations are going to be handled mostly by the hippocampus. So that when you do go to sleep, the hippocampus takes all that information and translates it up into the cortex, the seat of long-term memory. And so it does this by reactivating the associations, the learned associations. Paris is in France. Paris also has the Eiffel Tower. All these things that help cue you into sort of this fact that Paris is the capital of France, and it gets consolidated via reactivation, particularly during slow wave sleep or deep sleep. And essentially what the brain does is replaying that memory, those associations at a very rapid pace, about 10 times the usual pace of encoding. It's being replayed over and over and over again and forming this sort of associative net in the higher parts of the brain, the cortex, where it will ideally be stored long-term. And then again, the next day, you're more likely to retrieve things if you had a good night's sleep, particularly a good period of slow wave sleep, and you're better able to recall these memories due to the associative power that's provided by slow wave sleep. So this is a really critical feature, replaying what's learned during the day and then integrating and associating it in the higher order brain, the cortex, critical for learning. So what happens if that doesn't happen? If we have fragmented sleep, if we don't get good quality slow wave sleep, or if we have frequent wakings, or we have trouble going to sleep, these are all sort of components that increase the risk of accumulating tau or amyloid proteins in the brain, which have been associated with the onset of Alzheimer's disease. It's also interesting to know that in the reduction of slow wave sleep is coincident with age. So as you get older, you have less slow wave sleep, you have more trouble getting to sleep, and you have more frequent wakings. So it's a perfect storm for memory issues that may sort of also coincide with the lack of waste removal. As I mentioned, this glymphatic system of the brain, which cleans the brain, is only functional during slow wave sleep. And in the absence of good quality slow wave sleep, you may not efficiently clear out all the waste material of the brain, including amyloid. And further, you're not consolidating, you're not replaying those learning opportunities you had during the day in rapid fashion due to fragmentation in your sleep. And therefore, the transfer from the hippocampus, early learning, to the cortex, long-term learning, is disrupted and unfortunately can lead to cognitive decline, and in the worst case scenarios, a disease process such as Alzheimer's. So notably, I think what most sleep experts would say and clinicians would say is that early intervention is critical. If you find that you're having trouble with sleep now in your middle age or late middle age, prior to the 8th, 9th, 10th decade of life, it's good to try and address these issues now. Don't let them slide, as a late stage interventions are really difficult to enact, and they aren't as quite as effective as a midlife intervention to appropriate the benefits of good sleep. And then one other factoid about this that I think is interesting technologically is that maybe there's a way that technology can improve these inherent properties of slow wave sleep, which are less viable, less proficient in your older years, by bolstering the function of the glymphatic system. So right now there's a proposal, I think it's being funded by the DoD, where they have this cap, you can put on this cap, and it selectively engages the lymphatic system to potentiate that cleaning process in the absence of good sleep. So who knows, maybe, in several decades from now, we simply wear a cap and not be so dependent upon our good sleep practices. But I don't want to say that's going to happen, but that would be a nice boon to our efforts to get better sleep. Okay, so sleep pressure. This is something also sort of new to me, and I think it's quite fascinating. And I became recently aware of the fact that if you don't sleep at all, you will die. So I was unaware that had these high stakes were a product of poor sleep. But in fact, if you don't sleep forever, you will not survive. So these, as I said from the outset, these are critical life supporting functions that occur during sleep. And in the absence of those, leads to increased mortality. So thankfully, the body has an elegant system by which it applies pressure via two independent systems to ensure that we fall asleep every night. And these two systems are namely adenosine. And this is a byproduct of metabolism during the day. It builds up over the context of a day. And once it reaches a certain level, it induces this sort of sleepy state of attention. It makes us more likely to lay down and to seek sleep just because of the pressure exerted by the buildup of adenosine. And the other process, which functions completely independently, which is quite fascinating, is the circadian rhythm, which is thought to be kind of your brain's clock or internal clock. And this circadian system is mediated by a hormone called melatonin. Probably all very familiar with this. And melatonin is only produced in response to darkness. It's only produced by the pineal gland. So when you have light coming in or you have sunlight overhead, your pineal gland shuts off the production of melatonin. And this may be some explanatory power as to why having too much light at night is bad for you. You're sort of zapping your built-up of melatonin after the sun sets. And this could also disrupt your circadian rhythm. But both of these work independently to ensure that we have that pressure of wanting to fall asleep and getting adequate sleep to restore our body and our brain. So your behaviors affect your sleep. It's quite clear that, caffeine, coffee, soda, however you take it, chocolate, is definitely sort of an alertness promoting experience. And the reason why it is biologically, it fits really nicely into the adenosine receptor. So as I said before, as adenosine builds up throughout the day due to its metabolic byproduct, it fits into this receptor site. And once these receptor sites are full, by the end of the day, you're kind of feeling that sleep pressure. But caffeine effectively blocks that receptor, and that's what it does primarily with regard to alertness and sleep. It does nothing to the attenuation of the buildup of adenosine. The same amount of adenosine is still accumulating, but the receptor is not getting the message. So your brain is not getting the message that, hey, it's the end of the day and I should probably be sleeping. And moreover, the half-life or the effects, how long the effects of caffeine persist, the half-life is like 4 or 5 hours. So you can have caffeine in your system well into the evening if you're having an afternoon cup of coffee, which could disrupt your sleep. And because of the mechanism by which it binds this and prohibits this message from occurring in the brain that you are actually sleepy. So that's one behavior we need to sort of be mindful of, not taking caffeine too late in the day, such that it will affect your sleep onset. Another behavior is alcohol consumption, and this is a much more complex process. But as I showed before at the outset, there's this characteristic cycling that occurs throughout the night as you traverse the 4 stages of sleep. And alcohol, shown here in light gray, is a very different waveform that's quite distinct from the healthy waveform. As you can see, you have prolonged slow wave and you have almost an absence of REM sleep. And again, as I said before, REM is key and critical for the release of testosterone, for the processing of emotional material, for learning and memory. These are all sort of component operations of REM. If you forestall those or wipe those out by virtue of alcohol too late in the day, again, also has a half-life, has a decay period. It's about 1 hour per ounce. This can also affect the quality of your REM sleep, which affects in turn all these downstream physiological and brain-based behaviors and functions like learning and memory. So again, the recommendation here based on this data would be like, hey, you have to sort of control your consumption into the evening, or perhaps even cut it off. And perhaps Eric can say a bit more about this in a more definitive way as we get into our Q&A. So proceeding from there, again, with the knowledge that your behaviors affect your sleep, and I point out a couple negative behaviors, or at least, behaviors that make us a little more vulnerable to a poor night's sleep. What can you do that's positive? So we have some preliminary evidence suggesting that training on something like BrainHQ, doing exercises to improve your attention, your speed of processing, your memory, have a beneficial effect on sleep. And this study I'm referencing here is a study done in the military with veterans, 28 veterans that were coming back from Iraq or Afghanistan. participated in 6 hours of BrainHQ training relative to a control condition. And those folks that did the 6 hours of training, particularly on tasks such as freeze frame, were able to spend more time in bed asleep than awake. And this ratio is known as your sleep efficiency. And they were also faster to fall asleep, and they had better improved maintenance of sleep. They had less waking after sleep onset. So maybe there's something there with regard to sort of bolstering the speed, the attention, and the memory capacities of your brain that can be beneficial or prophylactic, protective against poor sleep, as shown in this preliminary data. Now, this is also being followed up by a larger clinical trial in the next couple of years, funded by the National Institutes of Aging, to look further into this preliminary effect. Can BrainHQ affect and benefit sleep regulation? So stay tuned for more on that. All right, so how do you improve your sleep? Obviously, we'll get a bit more into this in the Q&A, but what may be most useful at the outset is to keep a sleep diary, to learn how to appreciate your specific sleep patterns, and logging things such as the time you get in bed, and then the best of your ability, what time you think you fell asleep. Did you have any wakings during the night that you're aware of? And then what's your wake up time? Upon wake up, you may ask yourself, do I feel rested? What was the quality of my sleep? And then throughout the day, you can also answer the question as you go to bed the next night, did I have any daytime dysfunction due to a poor night's sleep, and how did that affect me? And then track this over a course of 7 to 10 days to get a consistent pattern established, and then sort of decide where you may make incremental changes in various aspects of what we'll talk about, what is known as sleep hygiene, which I think is the next slide here. Yeah, so this bedtime routine that we've was part of the poll here is characterized as what's called sleep hygiene. And this is comprised of a few general recommendations, which are borne out in the science, and I think if followed diligently and consistently can serve to improve your sleep overall, such as keeping a consistent bedtime and awake time, having some pre-bed routines like reducing the amount of stimulation, not engaging the brain too much in action movies or things that really rile up your alertness system, or opening the can of worms on unresolved issues before you go to bed. Also a bad idea. You also may want to reduce your light exposure. As I mentioned before, light reduces the amount of melatonin production, including the phone, the computer, the TV. And then also keeping your bedroom dark and cool and only for sleep. Oftentimes we're tempted to read in bed or do other work in bed. And this sort of reduces the associative value of transitioning from your waking state into this bed, which is the ideal situation for sleep, and sort of reifying that connection between context and behavior. And as I mentioned before, avoiding caffeine and alcohol intake late in the day. These are all things you can do from a sleep hygiene perspective. And then in addition to that, during the day, try to get sufficient light exposure and exercise. Enough activity and light exposure ensures that your brain is locked into the necessary cues that signal a transition from waking state to sleep. And these have been shown to be beneficial in terms of sleep regulation over the long haul. Okay, that's what I have to say. Thanks for your attention on that.
All right. Awesome, Tom. Thank you so much. Lots of really great information throughout that whole presentation. So let's go ahead and move on to the discussion portion. So I, mentioned that Dr. Eric Prather is a professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences. He's the director of the Behavioral Sleep Medicine Research Program. And he also co-directs the Aging, Metabolism, and Emotion Center at the University of California, San Francisco. Eric, as I understand, you are also kind of focusing more on insufficient sleep and how that sort of impacts your immune system over time. Is that right?
Yeah, and I'm also a clinician and help run an insomnia clinic here at UCSF, and so always interested and excited about talking about how we can get people sleeping better.
Yeah, absolutely. So Tom, I will go ahead and leave you two to talk about some sleep, and I'll start fielding some of those questions for you all in just a minute.
Great. Well, Eric, pleased to have you here. Thanks for volunteering to join us today. Really appreciate your expertise and insights. And please feel free to correct any errors I may have made in my short presentation there. This seems to be an emerging science, but I did have a few things on my mind, most notably personal in some respects. I won't disclose too much, but I'm sure others may share the same questions. So I'll just jump right in if that's okay.
Yeah.
How much sleep can I afford to lose? Because honestly, I have disruptions in my sleep from time to time, and how much of that is going to produce a burden on me over the long haul?
That's a really great question. And I think, it's at the crux of the challenge around sleep science, and it's around understanding individual sleep need, right? I mean, we don't have a great metric for that because it's like, need for what? Is it need for your brain to work well, to be sharp and remember things? Is it for your immune system to function best? And so, I think at the end of the day, it comes down to how people are feeling during the day, right? Their daytime functioning, whether they feel like they can be their best selves. I mean, we know from kind of the population level data, as I said in the beginning, that people probably need around at least 7 hours of sleep per night. But we also know that how that's structured during the night matters, right? So, you can get 7 hours of sleep, but be working at it for 12 hours, which means there was lots of fragmentation across the night. And that just doesn't feel good. People don't feel restored. And so, one of the things that we do in clinic is really try to work in getting that sleep consolidated, because if you can get your sleep consolidated, it just feels more restorative. And we do know from like lots of different studies that it does seem to be around this 7 hour mark that it is confers kind of benefits for health. So once people start to get down to 6 or 5 hours, particularly in the 5 hour range, that for most people, that might have a biological cost in the long term. And so we would want to kind of try to look at that. That's not to say that every individual that's true. We have discovered some kind of genetically short sleepers, people that really only need to sleep 4 or 5 hours and seem to be, perfectly healthy. I think the challenge is that most people who think they're genetically short sleepers are not, right? and so they're often kind of, folks that kind of are not perhaps investing in their sleep in the same way that they invest in their day. Or there's something else going on, like a sleep disorder, that is making it just really challenging for them to get the sleep they need. And that's opportunities for interventions.
Yeah, I like the term invest. That's a really a good way to sort of frame your sleep behaviors, because we invest in our physical health by exercising and eating the best we can. But we fairly, at least personally, I don't think of my sleep as an investment, but clearly it is from what we're learning about the biological implications of not sleeping well.
I mean, I think, across all aspects of science in the sleep science field, we know that people are just better off when they prioritize getting that sleep. People are kind of healthier. They're better to cope with stress. They're better parents. They're better partners. They're more empathetic. They're more productive at work. And they just kind of enjoy life better when they have the resources that sleep confers, right? And so, there's obviously lots of important things that happen during sleep that are critical for health. But even more than that, in our day-to-day lives, kind of ensuring that we get that sleep will make what we do during the day that much better, which is oftentimes what is kind of incentivizing for people, because we do notice it. I mean, any example of when you have a bad night of sleep, how kind of the world is a little bit a harder place, right? Like the traffic is a little bit slower, you get in more conflicts, and people tend to be irritable or more anxious or more down or depressed. I mean, those things kind of impact how we function in the world. And it turns out that by focusing on sleep and ensuring that we're putting ourselves in the best possible position to get that restorative sleep, the better we'll be in kind of lots of domains of our life.
Yeah, that makes good sense, and it's great sort of to appreciate the value of that investment. What's the return on my investment? Oh, I'm more alert, more awake. I have better relationships, more peace and harmony in my life. Generally speaking, less road rage. So I want to put you on the spot here with this next question. I know that caffeine and alcohol have an impact on sleep, particularly if it's later in the day, and they have a defined half-life. We kind of know how long this chemical will influence your biology, but how late could I drink a cup of coffee in the day, Eric? Can you tell me, please, what's the answer here?
Yeah, I know, right? I mean, this is the challenge, right? We're fixers, right? We've come up with lots of different ways to kind of help us stay awake and help us fall asleep, and those things are kind of not the most natural of chemicals, but for kind of constant consumption. But yet, so I mean, as you said in your presentation, I mean, the half-life, typically is between 5 and 6 hours for caffeine. So, if you have a double espresso at 8 p.m., half a single espresso is still in your body 6 hours later, right? And so no surprise that your sleep tends to be harder for people to get to sleep. And then once they do get to sleep, their sleep structure is lighter, right? Like we just it's hard to kind of get into that deepness when so much of that those adenosine receptors are being blocked by caffeine. And also what happens is, as you mentioned, the kind of the homeostatic sleep drive, that kind of really important pressure that builds up, that is still building when people are, even though caffeine is blocking it. So that's why people have this crash after it's gotten to a certain level, because now you're kind of walloped with all of this adenosine that has been building up in your brain. Alcohol, as you mentioned, is it's really soporific. It helps people relax. It hits on those GABA receptors to help us, kind of experience the relaxation that is necessary for sleep. But it does change our sleep architecture. It does create kind of extra deep sleep, more rebound of REM in the second part of the night, which is associated with fragmentation. And, because it hits on these relaxation receptors in the brain, when that wears off, your brain notices, right? And it becomes kind of hyper aware that it doesn't have this chemical anymore. And that creates kind of more wakefulness in the night. And so as kind of a practice, usually we say in the clinic, maybe just have that one glass of wine with dinner, right? As long as it's, 3 hours, say, until your bedtime, that's probably okay. But, don't turn it into 3 glasses of wine or 4 glasses of wine or what have you, because, you're certainly on the road to where it can impact your sleep, and it kind of impairs your judgment a little bit, right? Where now you've had those couple glasses of wine, you're like, oh, well, maybe a fifth or whatever. But so in moderation. We're not the fun police here at the sleep clinic, but there are certainly consequences.
Sure. I appreciate that. It's sort of the irony that, hey, they had too much alcohol and they passed out. Well, they didn't really pass out into good sleep. They passed out into fragmented, disruptive sleep.
Yeah.
Maybe a better way to characterize it. So let me ask you one more before we open up to the audience here. And this is, I think, a familiar one to a lot of people. How do I best get back to sleep after I wake up? So I slept great for 4 or 5 hours. Oh, I feel sort of restored, but I still want to get that REM sleep because I know it's important. How do I get back to sleep?
Yeah, that is often a challenge, and I think we all know that experience for sure. I think some of it has to do with kind of what is keeping you awake, right? So if it's like worries and thoughts and stressors, then we probably need to maybe benefit from doing something quiet and restful, ideally out of bed. So this is kind of one of the ironies, is like when people have a lot of awakenings during the night and it becomes kind of a chronic problem, it can really fracture the way you're experiencing the bed in the bedroom, such that it kind of feeds forward, where it begins to be kind of like a habit that your brain gets into. And so we need to kind of repair that. And so getting out of bed and actually doing something quiet until you begin to feel sleepy again, and then getting back in bed. Now, for kind of occasional things, that maybe you don't have to go that far, right? And so oftentimes people benefit from things that are just like not necessarily engaging, but are kind of distracting. So, maybe it's, doing a meditation. So, there's certainly apps that allow that, like Headspace or Calm or what have you. Reading is always a good thing, as long as it's not too engaging. Even watching television, certainly not turning on all the lights, but things that, can kind of distract your mind until you begin to feel sleepy again, can be really helpful. Sometimes, counting sheep, or, doing things that, counting backwards can be helpful. And it really is a personal preference, because it's really about the engagement of your brain, right? So for some people, they wake up and they start reading, and then next thing you know, the sun's coming up because they are so engaged in their book. And so that's probably not the right thing for them, right? But doing things that can distract your brain enough to bring on those sleepiness cues so that you can kind of get back into that restful space.
Okay, yeah, that's very helpful. And I think maybe just getting used to getting up out of the bed when you're in those periods of consistently waking up over several nights is probably the biggest hurdle. But I imagine once you get up and sort of distract your mind in some way or engage in a low level activity, you just naturally start to get more drowsy.
Yeah,
so
and it's because that homeostatic sleep drive is building up, still in there, right? You still have that sleepiness on board. It's true as you get kind of towards the 4 or 5 a.m. where you've kind of like, drained out a lot of that homeostatic sleep pressure. It is more challenging, but certainly not a lost cause. And certainly what you don't want to start doing is getting distressed about it, right? Like as soon as you start kind of worrying about the fact that you're not sleeping, you've kind of lost the battle for that night, right? And that really kind of contributes to kind of regular insomnia types of experiences.
Yeah. Thank you. That's a very helpful answer. I mean, one thing I did recently was I took the clock out of the bedroom. So even if I do wake up, I don't know what time it is, I just try and go back to sleep. I don't have that sort of anxiety, but oh my God, it's only 3 a.m. How am I going to make it through? So but I have a dozen more questions, but I will submit to the audience here and allow them to ask a few questions about sleep for our expert.
Yeah, sounds good. Okay, so we have a million questions, as you guys can probably see there. But I'm seeing a lot of questions about whether sleep needs to be consecutive in order to be effective. We were just talking about, getting up for an hour and then going back in. Real quick, what's sort of the final verdict on that, would you say?
Yeah, biphasic sleep is an amazing phenomenon. And I mean, it's not a phenomenon, it's something that, seems like it existed, and is certainly in line with kind of the sun going down and the sun coming up. And the fact that, look, humans can only make so much sleep, right? Like you can want to sleep 15 hours, but you're not going to, right? And so what happens because there's more than 8 hours between when the sun goes down and the sun comes up, if you did that, you would necessarily have this biphasic sleep cycle. And so it seems like it's certainly not harmful. And if it's something that is kind of part of your day-to-day that you can fit in with your life, it's no big deal. I think the challenge is that, many of us don't live in a world where we can kind of live by those kind of things, right? I mean, like our life is structured in such a way and the biphasic model is hampered by electricity indoors, right? Like that's what changed everything around that. And so it's certainly kind of a really interesting phenomenon. People, I think it also really underscores kind of the way of approaching wakefulness in the night as not this kind of worst thing ever, right? Like it's certainly kind of a natural phenomenon and not one to be feared. And in those days, people kind of really enjoyed that time, right? And so, I think it's an important part of being human, and it's a great example of how technology has kind of changed how sleep might have worked naturally.
Yeah, because 100 years ago, we didn't have a bunch of electricity in our homes, and it wasn't expected. It sounds like people weren't expected to sleep through the night. You had that, gap in your night and in your sleep cycle.
Yep.
All right. And so I'm seeing also a lot of questions about naps. When are naps helpful? What's the ideal time for a nap? How long should you sleep for in a nap? Anything about coffee naps and how caffeine can interact with those? Can you guys speak to that at all?
Yeah, I can, but I'm Tom, if you want.
Oh yeah, I mean, you're the expert here. I certainly have some ideas about it, but I don't have any definitive answers. So
yeah, sure. So I mean, naps can be really helpful, right? I mean, people do them, they feel more alert if they do them right. It's been shown to help with learning, all of those types of things, because sleep is so critical. I think where it can get tricky is, if it's a symptom of something, right? So if it's affecting your sleep at night, right? I mean, if we think about the homeostatic sleep drive, I like to think of it as like a big balloon that's kind of filling up with sleepiness. And if you nap, it really can like steal some of that sleepiness out of the balloon, right? So that when you get to bedtime it's not as full as it used to be. And so if your expectation is that you're going to fall asleep at the normal time and you're going to sleep through the night, no problem, that then you think, oh, well, maybe the nap wasn't such a good idea. But for people that, especially as we get older, it's certainly the case that, people feel sleepy during the day. And certainly during that circadian dip in the mid-afternoon time where people can get a nap and feel a lot better and get through the rest of their day. So it's not inherently bad. It sometimes, can be a symptom of sleep deprivation or other things going on in your life, because there's lots of things that can make people sleepy and fatigued, right? Like medical concerns. The other thing that I would say about naps is the duration matters, right? So one of the things that we always want to be aware of is if we sleep really long, especially if we get over to kind of that 30-minute mark, there's an increased chance that you're going to fall into deep sleep, right? And what happens is when it ends, people feel just often, and maybe people on the call have felt this way, where you just feel terrible. You feel worse than you did before you went to sleep, right? And that's called sleep inertia. That's because it's really hard to pull yourself out of that deep state. And it's really uncomfortable. And then finally, around caffeine naps, I think that's a really cool idea. We do know that it takes like 30 so minutes for you start to feeling the effects of caffeine. And so what people do, for people who don't know about them, you drink a cup of coffee right before you take a nap, and then it's like you come out of the nap and it's like a boost. And so, I think it's a great like N of one experiment that people can do on themselves. I mean, it's certainly not good. I mean, that, again, with the caveat that, don't want to do it like 2 hours before you're trying to go to sleep at night. But otherwise, it's a pretty creative strategy.
I'm glad to hear that, as somebody who relied on coffee naps quite a lot throughout college and school. That's good for me.
Excellent.
Is there any limitations on how long you should nap, or you should not nap beyond a certain time period or time during the day? Is that
I mean, I think it's more as it gets closer to bedtime, it definitely changes the likelihood that you'll be able to fall asleep easily. And so I think that's where the timing comes in. I mean, most people tend to take naps kind of in that like 2 to 4 p.m. period, or 1 to 3 p.m. period, kind of the siesta time. And that's because that's like a biological dip in your circadian rhythm. And so that's why those exist in those cultures that have kind of changed. I mean, but you also look at those cultures that have siestas, their dinner is way later, their nights are way later. I mean, like, right, they kind of like compensated, because again, you can only make so much sleep. And so, it's part of it.
Yeah, fascinating.
Yeah. We've had quite a few people ask about whether you have recommendations for sleep measuring devices or products to help track sleep throughout the night.
Yeah. I mean, so there are tons of devices in this space. It's a really exciting time for sleep and people that are interested in sleep, and it's kind of increased the kind of collective consciousness around sleep because of these tools. And they do a pretty good job in general, like measuring things like how long you've been asleep and how fragmented your sleep is. Currently, there aren't really great devices to get at architecture, so how deep your sleep is and how much REM you got. It's really a matter of when, not if, that these devices will be able to do that, because technology is improving all the time. The one caveat that I would have is, oftentimes people, if their data suggests that they're not getting great sleep, they tend to get really anxious about it. So I mean, and in fact, a couple years ago, the term was coined orthosomnia, which is an insomnia that develops because of people's wearable device data, right? And so, you have to kind of, these are really consumer-based products. They can help inform how you're living and going about your day, and they're probably really good if you kind of manipulate something in your life to see what the change is. So kind of within person, they're probably pretty accurate, but kind of they're not the same as going to a sleep lab and getting kind of gold standard measurement. And so I wouldn't read too much into it. But if you do have a concern, certainly bring that up with your primary care physician, and maybe end up seeing like a sleep medicine expert like myself, or people that do this type of work. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So there's also a ton of questions about melatonin. Now,
Yep.
disclaimer again, we aren't practicing medical doctors. We're not giving
No.
out advice.
Yeah.
But can you speak to like general practices, like if we are supplementing or if we're taking melatonin supplements, for example, to try and get sleepier at a more reasonable time, for example?
Yeah, of course. I mean, yeah, I mean, certainly melatonin is really common. The clinical trial data is at least specifically for kind of like falling asleep for treating insomnia. It's not particularly strong. And it's not recommended. It doesn't kind of meet the criteria for like recommending it as a supplement for that. What it's really good at and what's been shown to be really effective in is in the context of things like jet lag, right? So kind of because what it's focused on is and acting on is your circadian rhythm. And so, when people travel, say, to the East Coast or they travel to the UK or what have you, supplementation at like very low doses, so usually like 0.5 milligrams of melatonin, which is hard to get, is not kind of the type that you get at the store, but a very low dose and around 5 hours. Take it 5 hours before you want to be asleep in that place will kind of slowly shift your rhythm towards that bedtime. And so that's where it's been shown to be most effective. The other thing that people worry about is like chronic use of melatonin and whether it's going to have kind of burn out their pineal gland and things like that. At present, there's not any strong evidence that's the case. I mean, obviously, these are not developed to take a chronic use. And so that data is still growing, but at present, we don't think that is necessarily the case on average.
All right. Well, you heard it here, folks. Okay, so I think we have time for one last question. A lot of people seem to be writing in about sleep apnea. A lot of
Yeah.
people are writing in about wearing their CPAP masks and how, is that sometimes getting disturbed in the middle of the night, having to adjust the mask or, whatnot. Is wearing the CPAP mask going to be more beneficial for somebody with sleep apnea, or is, sleeping without the CPAP, like what are sort of the pros and cons of that?
Yeah. I mean, sleep apnea is, if there was something we could tackle in sleep medicine better, it would be that, because there's a lot of people that are kind of underdiagnosed or undiagnosed, and so, but CPAP therapy is definitely kind of a tried and true method for reducing obstructions during the night, and so absolutely, it is better for your sleep to wear it than to not. But obviously it's not, for some people it can be really challenging, and so I would just urge them to work with their sleep medicine provider, their DME, which is like the people that provide the sleep app and the device, to look for alternatives to improve the adherence to that, because we know that untreated obstructive sleep apnea can really have detrimental effects, not only on your sleep, but on kind of like your cardiovascular, cardiometabolic health, and most likely kind of all the other things that we heard about today. And it's related to both kind of the fact that people aren't getting sleep and it's fragmented, but also the hypoxemia that people experience when their sleep is obstructed or their respiratory function is obstructed. So absolutely wear it. But work with your provider to try and find a better solution so that you can be more adherent.
Awesome. All right. So let's go ahead and start wrapping up the webinar today. One thing that I did want to share is some more information about Eric, which you can see on the screen here. You can view his profile on the University of California, San Francisco site. And also you can go to that link, which we'll include in the email that we're sending out next week, to pre-order his book, The Sleep Prescription. Do you want to do a quick little blurb about your book and what to expect from it?
Yeah. I mean, I'm super passionate. I hope it's clear about sleep. And, I think there's a lot of things that people can do. And so, what I basically did in this book was distill what we do in the clinic, which we've seen hundreds and hundreds of people with sleep problems, particularly insomnia, and tried to provide some steps that people can take to try to get their sleep back on track. You know, sleep is one of those things that we all need to survive, but oftentimes things get in the way. And so this is about trying to remove those barriers to let your body do what it is supposed to do naturally. I always say that like sleep is one of those things that we never wonder how it works until it stops. And so this is to help kind of get those barriers out of the way so that it can happen more naturally.
All right, awesome. All right, and then let's do real quick, any final takeaways that you want, like if you are skipping most of the webinar or you're just wanting like the real quick summary, what is the main takeaway that you want people to have walking away from the webinar today?
I mean, what I would say is, you know, you can start improving your sleep today, right? It is something that happens naturally, but it can be challenging. And so, you know, doing the things that you need to try to transition to make that time available to let your body wind down and putting yourself in the right position to be able to sleep better tonight, taking the pressure off. But if you don't sleep well tonight, there's always tomorrow. And I think we're really resilient to kind of the difficulties of a bad night's sleep. But there are lots of things that we can do, from kind of, you know, trying to stabilize our wake time to you know, ensuring that we have a proper wind down, to not consuming too much caffeine too close to bedtime, to, you know, making your bed a shrine to sleep, and then not kind of forcing it, right? It's part of the lived experience, and your body knows what to do. And so oftentimes what happens is we're the people in the way of our sleep. And I think that's important, but we can also be the solution. So, you know, I hope everyone has a good night's sleep, but if you don't, you know, you can slowly chip away at it to improve your overall well-being.
Awesome. All right. Well, oh yeah, Tom, sorry. Did you want to add
Oh,
something?
no, that was well said. And I think what resonates with me mostly from this discussion is sort of the investment. You can invest in your life, your physiology, your health, your long-term cognitive vitality by paying more attention to your sleep behaviors. So thanks again, Eric. Appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Eric, so much for joining us. Thank you, Tom, for the presentation and for running the webinar with me today. And thank you, everybody in the audience, for tuning in. I know we ran a little long there, but I appreciate you sticking in there. Now, we have one more webinar coming up in just a couple of weeks. Our next webinar is going to be about BrainHQ's auditory exercises. That's going to be taking place on November 16th. So keep your eyes peeled for an email from us. And otherwise, I hope you all are going to have a wonderful rest of your day and are hopefully going to take better steps to having a better night's sleep going forward. All right. Thanks so much, everyone.